informed, equal partners in choosing a course of action. One way boomers are navigating through the complex environment of the 21st century is with technology. Although this generation was not born into the high-tech world, as today's young adults were, they have adapted rapidly to it. Most use computers and the internet. Many might be described as gadget crazy, rushing out to buy the newest technological innovation even before all the bugs are worked out. They increasingly rely on the internet to communicate with other people, get information for work and home, and to make purchases. They did not grow up with computers, but they did grow up with an equally influential 20th century technology, television. Although much of the offerings found on television are mindless, many are educational, and it is the baby boomers' desire to learn about the world and to make sure their children do as well that has driven the increase in educational programming on television. Television has brought the world into their living rooms, familiarizing them with cultures and events that help shape their attitudes and outlook. Many boomers have a broader view of the world, not only from what they watch on television and what they read, but from personal experience. The baby boom generation is the best traveled of any age group in the U.S. Whether for business or pleasure or both, boomers are ranging wider and wider in their travels. International travel is increasing rapidly. While Europe was once the primary destination for Americans traveling outside the U.S., increasing numbers are heading to Latin America and Asia. One impetus for this is to connect with their own roots. Racial and ethnic diversity is greater among boomers than among older Americans. While 84% of people aged 65 or older are of European descent, among boomers, a lower 75% are. 10% of boomers are Latinos and 11% are African American. 11% of the older boomers and 12% of the younger half are foreign-born. Although some boomers are bilingual, especially those who are first or second generation Americans, most are not. With the prevalence of English in the international business community, boomers are generally able to accomplish what they need to without a second language. But there are disadvantages to speaking only English, and many boomers are aware of this. The publishing industry has also discovered this problem, and they are making substantial sums of money selling language learning aids to boomers and other Americans. But it is unlikely that this generation will become multilingual to a large degree. Their children's generation is more likely to take on this responsibility. Even though they may not speak the language, boomers all over the world are a major part of the growing globalization trend. They understand the need to connect with people in other nations, both personally and professionally. Most of the world's post-World War II generations grew up during an era of increasing communication across national boundaries. Television, as we mentioned, brought other cultures into their living rooms. Automobiles and airplanes enabled many people to travel further in a day than their grandparents could have traveled in a month. Telephones brought a personal connection that transmitted information instantly rather than having to wait for letters to be delivered and responded to. All of these technologies have, in effect, shrunk the world. While older generations have sometimes struggled to understand how they fit into this smaller planet, boomers throughout the world have rapidly grasped the many opportunities it presents. As I mentioned before, baby boomers are already very well traveled, but they are likely to travel even more in the coming years because the composition of their households is beginning to change. Today, more than 3/4 of baby boomers had family households. 60% are married couple households. But the proportion with children varies widely. Nearly 1/4 of the youngest boomers have children at home. But among the oldest boomers, a much lower 9% have children under age 18 still living at home. As more boomers reach the stage of life at which their children are grown, their increased freedom will prompt them to do many of the things they have long deferred. Not only will they travel more, many will volunteer in their communities, start a new business, or return to school. In many ways, these will be among the best years of their lives, since they will not only have the freedom to do what they want, but the income to support their hobbies and interests. Many boomers will find, however, that they must pursue their interests on their own, either because of divorce or the death of a spouse. Currently, 12% of boomer men and 9% of boomer women live alone, but a considerably larger percentage of older adults live alone. Among people aged 75 or older today, 22% of men and fully 53% of women live alone. Given the independent character of boomers, the share who live alone later in life may surpass that of current seniors. One thing that won't change as they grow older is the level of attention focused on boomers. Since birth, this generation has been in the spotlight, and yet they are still frequently misunderstood. I'd like to take a few minutes now to discuss the personality of the baby boom generation. The first generation of post-war Americans, the baby boom grew up in a time of optimism and economic expansion. They were raised by young, stay-at-home mothers to be independent and to believe that they control their own destinies. During the 1960s, this upbringing manifested itself in the anti-authoritarian counterculture movement. In the 1980s, it translated into see how fast I can get rich materialism. In the 1990s, boomer individualism was apparent in increased entrepreneurialism, the self-help movement, and the rise of New Age spiritualism. Today, boomers are redefining middle age, refusing to give up their youthful outlook and grow old gracefully. One of the most important truths about boomers is that they are still the youth market. In their teens and 20s, more than 3 decades ago, boomers created the youth market. As they enter their 40s and 50s, millions of self-indulgent, demanding, and fun-loving boomers are proving that youth is a state of mind rather than a stage of life. Most boomers are still youthful, refusing to adopt the attitudes and lifestyles of their parents. While their parents wore their wrinkles with pride, boomer men and women are demanding products that will eliminate or at least hide them. Getting older once meant getting bigger and more conservative-looking cars. But many boomers are hopping into convertibles and onto motorcycles when they go on vacation. Rather than seeing the sights from the windows of a bus, boomers are on foot or in their own cars looking for new adventures. This generation also intends to meet their old age in good health, although they are loosening up a little on their once strict health consciousness. As life expectancy increases, they don't want to just live longer, only to find this means living their last years in poor health. Unfortunately, however, the difference in the death rates of men and women has not changed substantially. And this means many boomer women will outlive their spouses. In fact, boomer women already slightly outnumber boomer men. There are 96 men for every 100 women aged 35 to 54. As the baby boom generation brings its youthful attitudes and values to middle age, they are changing the way society looks at growing older. Rather than settling into a quiet old age, this generation will continue to be a force in consumer markets, the political arena, and society in general for decades to come. In closing, I would like to give you some suggestions for applying some of the things we have discussed here to your own environment. First, look at the age structure of your own population. Are there both large and small generations? Is the number of older people increasing, as it is in most nations? Are women having fewer or more babies? Even if the population is relatively even now, eventually there is likely to be another baby boom. How might businesses and society respond when this occurs? Now, another issue to examine is how the middle-aged and young adults interact in the work environment. Are there conflicts created by the intergenerational dynamics, similar to what I discussed earlier? Do young workers feel their ideas are not taken seriously? Do older managers feel they do not get the respect their years of experience entitles them to? How could the two sides be brought together to understand each other's points of view. How might they take the best of both and create a better work environment and a more successful organization? By understanding the impact of the U.S. baby boom on business, society, and politics, you can be prepared to address these issues in your own nation. Thank you very much.
Let's begin with the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, and therefore we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax, which appear on your screen. We remind you to make your phone calls at a distance from the monitor to help avoid feedback. And today our first call comes from the Federación Nacional de Comerciantes in Medellín, in Colombia. And the question, please.
Our question is the following. Current world situation is known because it lives more in order to have than to be, and that's why we have violence, chaos, corruption, etc. What responsibility do you think the BB generation should assume given the panorama that we are faced with?
Wow, that's a great question. So, Susan, I'm going to tender this one to you to start things.
I think if I could rephrase the question a little bit, the question is sort of, we live more for material things than for values and sort of things that are non-material. And I agree, I think these are issues which impact us because they increase the likelihood of violence, because they change our value system in negative ways. The baby boom generation bears some responsibility for materialism in our cultures. I think that's true. However, I would resist the idea that we should blame them for the problem entirely. I think that all generations bear some of this responsibility, and it is incumbent upon the boomer generation to work to try and bring more spiritual values, more communal values into the culture. And I think as they get older, they will. Because one of the things that happens as we get older is we do turn from more material pursuits to more personal and spiritual pursuits. So I think that soon we will start seeing, I hope, some of that change.
Great answer, Susan. Thank you. Let's now go to our second question, which comes from the Technological University in Nezahualcóyotl in Mexico.
My question is, how can we use the knowledge of these baby boomers in our educational institutions, in our higher educational institutions, in universities?
Let's take this from a consulting perspective. How would you advise an organization to use that knowledge of the baby boomers, Charles?
One good way, I think, is to invite people into the classroom. I know I've done that as a volunteer a couple of times, where once a year, probably should be more often, people from all walks of life are invited to come in and tell younger people about what they do and take questions and answer and so on. I think that's a very good way. My sense is people would be very anxious to do it and would do it if asked more frequently.
I think it's a great tool. Susan, how about a follow-up on that?
Well, I think I agree, and what I would like to see is not just at the college level, but in elementary, secondary schools, the lower levels when children are young, bringing people from the community, business professionals and others, into the classroom to share their expertise. I think starting young is good.
Yeah, I've done that with my children, and I think I get more out of it than maybe they do, so I like that a lot.
it can go the other way too, where instead of bringing people into classrooms are brought out into the world.
You bet. They see how real things happen.
Sure.
Right.
Thank you. Great responses. Let's go to the Universidad Tecnológica in Panama. And your question, please.
Buenos días. We're calling from Panama, the heart of the world and the bridge of the universe. The topic, baby boomer generations, is very linked to the Generation A, that's the adult generation. Our question from our developing countries like Panama is in Central America is the concept of retirement. We know this is a right, but we see the human part that is very linked with the economic, the financial situation. The state as a country obligates you, forces you to implement these policies, but in a way that they're not very human. And the knowledge of the individuals is actually reduced vis-a-vis this great dynamics of global participation. In other words, human resources of people who have been retired is a great potential. And what policies do you think should be recommended to the countries, to the developing countries, given the state of things for the state and for the private sector, so that they recognize and acknowledge that there is this great wealth of knowledge, and so that they can create good policies for the countries and the populations and it's in general.
Okay, good. Thank you. A retention, if you will, of the intellectual experience and capital of that adult group. So, Susan, I'm going to come to you first on this one.
Yes, this issue is one which many people are having to address because, in part, if the large baby boom generation were all to retire when they reach the age at which they can receive pensions, they would bankrupt the pension system. Fortunately, the evidence exists now that many people will go on working past normal retirement age. In the U.S., we've done a number of things to begin to encourage older workers to either stay in the workforce or come back to the workforce. You can change your public policy to allow people to earn more and still collect public pensions. You can encourage businesses through various economic and other incentives to hire older workers. Many older workers are looking for part-time or other types of work that, in fact, there's a great need for workers in those types. So helping the employer match up with older employee is something that, as a public policy, we can do through private or public organizations. So, in fact, there are any number of ways to do this, and the good news is the evidence is that the baby boom generation will be likely to want to keep working. So I think if we push a little, if we work at it, we will be able to retain more older workers.
There's value to that, though. It seems to me that that's sort of how it used to be in the early days of cultures, that the older worker, the adult, the leader, taught the younger people.
Right.
We've sort of disenfranchised that, especially in the United States, I think. So let's go to our next question, which is from Sania Internet in La Habana, Cuba. And your question, please.
Our question is the following. The changes, the generation changes vary from one country to another because of the social events that have defined and characterized each country. This wave of baby boomers after the war in the United States is considered something unique, or do you think it's a generic concept that can also embrace other countries with this intensity higher or lower? And would our countries have these data that we could confirm on this information? For instance, could we get it from the UN organization or the OAS so that we can know if these phenomena has only happened in the US or if it also includes other countries? What about this wave? Is it really inclusive or not?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question.
Yes.
I'm going to go to Susan on this, not to keep Charles out of the loop here, but two pieces, the phenomenon of baby boomers,
Yes.
and then how to get data in other
Yes.
countries, because I don't think the U.S. is unique in the
Right.
generational change. So,
That's correct, and it is an excellent question. There are two things about this phenomenon. There is the number, which in the U.S. is enormous and certainly has a big impact on shaping them and making them who they are. But there is also the phenomena of being the first post-World War II generation. And the implications, the reason this makes them who they are is because of the technological changes, the globalization process, the sort of all of the things that have occurred in the second half of the 20th century made them who they are, and that is somewhat universal. And you're correct in saying the intensity, the degree can be greater or lesser, but there is, in a sense, this post-World War II generation in each country. So the other thing to watch for in your own country is, do you have larger and smaller generations, and will that impact your economy and society? You can go to the United Nations. The United Nations does keep a number of population statistics, and many of them are kept by age. You can also do your own surveys, sampling a relatively large number of people and seeing sort of what the family structure is and how they compare to the boom in the U.S. So, I mean, do go to the United Nations. Also, your own government, many countries do collect enough statistical information to provide you with this data.
again, that's a great question and a great response, Susan. Thank you. Let's move now to the Dirección General de Educación Tecnológica Industrial, CITES number 3 from Mexico, and thank you for your question.
Buenos días. Nuestra pregunta,
Our question is,
hay una mayor competencia
there is
para obtener empleo
greater
entre la
competition to
generación
obtain
baby boomers
employment
y
amongst the baby
generaciones más
boomers,
jóvenes.
or
¿Qué
between the
tendría
baby
que
boomers and younger generation.
cambiar los baby boomers
What would the baby
revertir
boomers need to
este
change in
fenómeno?
order to revert this phenomenon?
Charles, you're dealing with organizations now, I think, on some of these issues in business planning. How would you address that?
Well, I think it's particularly an issue in California, which we all understand is the youth culture, and some of it I think may be self-correcting. I read an article recently by a demographer suggesting that as we continue to age and our economy here expands, there will not be enough younger people to fill those positions that have always been available to them. And so, though there may be some age discrimination, employers will be faced with the possibility of either having unfilled jobs or rethinking how they are doing things and perhaps tapping into what some questioners have said is this great well of experience that we bring to the table in our generation.
Good, thanks. Quick follow-up on that, Susan.
I think that you will always have some competition between older and younger generations. But remember that in fact, can be a good thing. I don't mean that it's good to pit people personally against each other, but knowing that tension exists can force an organization to look at their culture, their structure, and figure out what they value and need in each individual position the most. So it can be good for the organization.
Good. Thanks to both of you. And another great question. Let's go now to the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California Sur in La Paz. And your question, please.
I'd like to ask, what impact should we expect for the future when there is a change in the population structure of the baby boomers, and what consequences will we have, and what should we have to adapt as a result of all this?
I wonder if that really deals with the boomers getting older as that generation changes. But Susan, you're shaking your head like you understood. So
sort of. The whole issue of the age structure of the population is something that obviously I've been emphasizing and that we need to be aware of. And age structures sometimes flatten out, and I think right now, at least in the U.S., that's where we're headed. And so we're going to have a little less conflict, in fact, between old and young as that occurs. But I don't think that it will ever stop being something to watch. You need to always be aware of the impact of a new rise in the number of births. The number of boomers is going to shrink because they're getting older, and by definition there are fewer of them each year, whereas the number of births is increasing because of just the larger population base. So I think that the impact of the boomers will diminish over time, but not anytime soon.
Thanks, Susan. Charles, quick follow-up on that?
Yes, I wonder if that might impact things like something as basic as housing costs, where I assume our large bulge has helped to drive up housing costs here, which is creating something of a problem for younger people. Yeah. And to the extent that we mature and leave this earth, there will be fewer people competing for those houses, and it may indeed help the younger population.